Welcome, everyone. My name is Rashana Chin. I'm legal counsel with ADF International and one of the members at large for the NGO Committee on the Family. We're really excited to have you attend our event today, where the topic will be commemorating Beijing plus 30, those who were there in 1995. I serve along with the committee's executive board, along with Vinnie Santoro and Marcia Barlow, who are co-chairs of the committee. Other members of the board include Lynn Walsh, Elizabeth Delgado, Ben Freer, Dale Gunn Lawton, and Ryan Coe. The mission of the NGO Committee on the Family New York is to advocate for the inclusion of family in international resolutions, policies, and programs at the UN. The NGO Committee on the Family New York is part of the Conference of the Non-Governmental Committees, or CONGO, and through the CONGO, the Committee on the Family participates in United Nations debates and decision-making, and the committee works cooperatively with other NGOs on substantive issues and brings expertise to government discussions at the United Nations. You can see more of the committee's work on our website at ngofamilyny.org. And we welcome your support and ask that you consider becoming a member. We're glad that you're all here to learn with us and have three wonderful speakers today who will be all introduced shortly. And we're really excited to convene this amazing panel to discuss and reflect on the details of the process that created the Beijing Declaration and the Platform for Action, which is the intergovernmental document that defined the political commitments that have defined the international agenda surrounding women for the last 30 years. I'm sure many of you may be already in town here in New York, where I'm based and where other members of the committee are based, attending the commission for the last 2 weeks. And really the thought of the board coming together and thinking about and reflecting on this event was, not all of us were at Beijing during those 30 years ago. So it would be really insightful to bring together a panel of esteemed members from civil society, from delegations, from academia, to learn about the process and some of the details regarding the negotiations, how the language involved in Beijing regarding the family, gender, motherhood, parents, etc. What were some of the controversies during those 30 years? And also, what's the legacy looking forward 30 years later, the implications? I'm sure some of you were here at the General Assembly last Monday when the latest political declaration was adopted by high-level ministers in the UN last Monday. So this is a document that the international community is still talking about, still reflecting on, still discussing the implications of, so that we can realize the full agenda of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action. And before we go into the actual substance of the event, I also wanted to make sure that all the attendees today were aware of the NGO Committee on the Family's event for next month, which will be held during the Commission on Population and Development. The committee is proud to host our second annual Family Policy and Population Research Forum. If you could just save the date on your calendar for that, it's going to be Tuesday, April 8th, and it will be held in person at the UN. So for those who are in New York or are willing to travel to New York, we'd love to host you there. More information will be sent out on our listserv, and you're welcome to visit our website to get on our listserv for that. So before we begin the event, I have a couple of brief housekeeping rules. The event is being recorded, so we want you to be aware of that. You can check on our website in a day or two and share this event and the recording with any friends or family that you think may be interested in the content and substance of the event. In an effort to minimize background noise, please place yourself on mute before the Q&A period ends. Each of the speakers will have about 10 to 15 minutes to present. And then depending upon the volume of questions, we may have an executive board member filtering some of those questions so that we can give each of the speakers adequate time to answer the questions they feel best equipped to address. And then with regard to questions, you're welcome to post your questions throughout the event in the chat section, or sending them directly to Marcia Barlow, who is currently in this gallery list right now. And you can also use raise your hand during using the Zoom tool. But again, we ask that you respectfully do that at the end of all of the presentations. And now formally, let me introduce our very first speaker, Professor Teresa Collette. She's a professor of law at the University of St. Thomas in Minnesota, where she directs the Pro-Life Center and teaches constitutional litigation. Professor Collette has testified before committees before the United States House of Representatives and the United States Senate, as well as numerous state legislatures. She's attended numerous sessions of the CSW as a representative of pro-life NGOs. In 2013, She was also a delegate to the 46th Annual United Nations Conference on Population and Development, the CPD, and she has also served as a delegate to the Holy See to the United Nations, and as a five-year term to the consultator to the Pontifical Council of the Family in 2009, where she was reappointed by Pope Francis to serve from 2014 to 2016 until the council was dissolved. And just as a side note, I'm a former student of Professor Collette's. I actually attended my very first CSW as a student of hers, I believe, over 10 years ago. So it's been a long time knowing Professor Collette as a dear professor and mentor of mine, and I'm excited to hear what she'll have to say to you all today. So the floor is yours, Professor Collette.
Well, thank you for that very kind introduction. And I have to confess that Roshana is one of my very favorite alums, and a remarkable man, brings both wisdom as well as knowledge to the role he plays at the United Nations. And I'm confident that we all benefit from his activities in that role. But today's focus is on the Beijing platform at 30. And I want to talk a little bit about what progress has been made. So let me share my screen. I've got a small PowerPoint that I'd like to share with you. And so hopefully that is up and you can see it. And of course, as we all know, the Beijing platform was intended to advance the interest of women and what they call gender equality, or the equality between men and women throughout the world. And the developing world has a stark set of problems that are quite different in nature than many of the problems that are involved in the current developed world. And that therefore makes a world agenda in this area very, very difficult. But the Secretary General's report, draft report on the implementation of the Beijing platform, reflects that there has been remarkable progress in these past 30 years. Globally, the Secretary General tells us the top three priorities for action in the last 5 years. I'm sorry, let me go back one. I'm trying to get where I can see this rather than, let me take my folks off here. I apologize. All right, here we go. What the Secretary General has observed is that we've had tremendous progress in the area of eliminating violence and against women and girls. 88% in the last 5 years of all countries that are involved in the Beijing platform have adopted laws or policies that in fact are directed at that. Now, some of that success isn't accurately reflected in the statutes, though, or in the reports that we get of acts of violence, in part because one of the great problems that existed 30 years ago and even exists today is the deafening silence that covers some of these crimes. So we would naturally expect that as societies move toward actually reporting these acts of violence and recording them for purposes of analysis and protection of women and girls, that we would see an uptick in crimes of violence. And in fact, we did see that. COVID was a particularly difficult period of time in terms of domestic violence, and much of that evidence is just beginning to come out because of the lockdowns around the world, et cetera. We've also had, excuse me, tremendous success in ensuring equality and non-discrimination under the law and access to justice. It wasn't all that long ago where in many countries women could not inherit, where women could not own property, could not operate businesses. And so those sorts of problems have been remedied in many, many countries by statutes and by effective government funding programs. Finally, we've seen tremendous strides in improving the quality of education for girls, training, and lifelong learning for women and girls. Almost half the countries in the world that are committed to the Beijing platform have passed legislation or have improved their programs in some appreciable way. These Unfortunately, that sort of progress that we see in these three areas is not true in all the areas. The areas least likely to be prioritized by states were gender responsive disaster risk reduction and resilience building, basic services and infrastructure, and strengthening women's participation in ensuring environmental sustainability. It seems, though, that as far as those things that affect women's day-to-day lives on a regular basis, that we are seeing great strides, and that the lower priorities are things that will not impact women directly on a day-to-day basis. We've also seen that, at least according to a Goldman Sachs research survey, that in the past 25 years, women's workforce participation has risen and pay caps have diminished. Now, the Secretary General continues to report that there's a 20% pay gap, but in many countries, that pay gap can be explained in part by voluntary part-time work by women as opposed to men. There has historically been a larger percentage of women, particularly mothers of small children, who have, when adequate financial support is available, have opted for part-time work instead of full-time work. But Goldman Sachs notice that progress is neither linear nor universal. Globally, women's share of non-paid work remains high, a major barrier to workforce participation and equality more generally. Women's participation fell during the pandemic as far as in the labor force, but generally has more than recovered. And pay gaps are high in older age groups, although even here the gaps have narrowed slightly. And there's a steady climb as far as most corporate related metrics, women that are in management, women that are in upper leadership, women in the C-suite. Now, of course, those criteria predominantly apply to the developed world, but nonetheless, we are seeing worldwide increased participation and increased pay. One of the things, though, that we're seeing in addition to the pandemic that may impact progress in this area is that birth rates have fallen dramatically almost everywhere and are becoming a topic of concern for governments and investors. At the same time, current working age populations are declining, or at the very least, growing in a substantially slower pace. In the absence of major productivity boosts, if economies aren't to shrink, we need higher participation by women and by older workers. So the birth dearth that we're seeing, or the demographic winter that seems to be developing, is an area of concern as far as economic productivity. But overall, the news is good. Women continue to progress. Poverty, especially extreme poverty. Globally speaking, the number of people living in extreme poverty has been on the decline for several decades, from 1.94 billion in 1982 to 696 million in 2017. This decrease is particularly encouraging because the Earth's population rose considerably during the same time period, from roughly 4.5 billion people in 81 to more than 7.8 billion in 2021. What we see, though, is there's still significant difference between extreme poverty. The blue line on this chart shows the number of men living in extreme poverty. That's people that are subsisting on less than $2.12 a day. And the number of women is much higher, although we see that all of it is declining, which is good news as a general matter. The other thing I would note, though, especially given that this is the forum for the family, is that children are 2 times more likely to live in extreme poverty than adults, and that's deeply problematic for the family. Roshana mentioned in his opening remarks the recent action last week on these issues and a call to action. And they adopted 6 goals for concrete action to achieve. One is promoting women's access to credit and entrepreneurship. Goldman Sachs also noted in its report on the past 25 years that women's entrepreneurship has basically exploded, and women are more likely than men to own and operate a business. They also noted that when we're talking about investing in entrepreneurial enterprises, that women's rate of return, the return on investment, runs somewhere about $1.86 for every dollar that's invested, whereas men's rate of return, at least according to their statisticians, runs about 82 cents per dollar. So women are more effective in achieving economic return on the investments that are made in their entrepreneurship. Another goal is reducing women's unpaid care work by expanding systems to care for children, the needy, and the disabled. As we see the aging of the population, the graying of the world's population, that need for increased care is important and something that has to be addressed. It's often provided by families and provided within the family. And yet that sort of care labor is something that precludes women's participation in the economic life of the country. If we measure it, however, it's a tremendous value in the economy itself. It also, the UN Declaration adopted the belief that reducing women's domestic work by promoting equal sharing of household responsibilities with women is an important goal that countries must take concrete steps toward achieving. Now, part of this, however, reflects that the natural desires of men and women sometimes differ. And so, how we actually reduce that domestic work by promoting equal sharing is something that we have found more resistant to cultural change, in part because of personal preferences. The other three goals that were adopted at that time is closing the digital divide so all women can benefit from technology and innovation. We've seen great strides in this as well, but like every good thing, there's a dark side to it. And when we look at the sexual violence, what we find is that with the development of AI and the expansion of technology, that women are often the victims of technological crimes such as representation of nudes, etc. 90% of all pornographic images worldwide involve women, as a matter of fact. So this digital advance is both a blessing and a curse. Ensuring access to quality education for girls and lifelong learning for women. That, of course, has been achieved in many of the Western nations. In fact, in the United States today, you're more likely to find a woman in law school than a man, or a woman in med school, even for the first time in the last 2 years, than a man. So women are, in fact, accessing quality education in the developed world, and we're seeing some strides in the developing world, especially in the Middle East. Adopting, implementing, and funding national plans to prevent and eliminate violence against women and children, women and girls. This is particularly important as competition for resources occurs, and we need a concrete plan to make sure that violence is diminished, especially the violence visited upon victims of war. And that, of course, is our third challenge that we've seen: the pandemic, the graying of the population, and the current international instability as far as war, the wars in the Middle East, the war in Europe, and the wars that continue to be waged in Africa. How do we protect all people from the scourge of war, but particularly the most vulnerable, women and children? And with that, I'll turn it back to the moderator. Thank you for allowing me to participate.
Thank you, Professor. I especially appreciated your presentation for some of the reflections on, some of the progress that's taken place in the last 30 years post-Beijing. It's amazing to hear of some of the economic progress, some of the capacity building that's taken place for women and girls. But of course, with what you mentioned, some of the new developments in technology and AI and the digital context, I mean, some of these were not contemplated in the initial 30 years of when Beijing was first drafted. And some of the challenges both provide opportunities and areas that still need to be addressed in future legal or other frameworks that require different political commitments by the member states. So with that, I want to check with the committee if our second speaker has arrived yet, and if not, we can go to our third. Can someone confirm if Christine Volmer is here?
She has not entered yet.
She has not entered yet. Okay, no problem. We will then go on to our third speaker, Susan Roylance. Susan Roylance is the founder of the NGO United Families International. She's been actively involved in many pro-family organizations for close to 50 years. Susan is an author and editor of several books related to promoting family policies at the United Nations, including the United Nations Negotiation Guide, the Family and the MDGs, or the Millennium Development Goals, Family Capital and the SDGs, and her most recent book, Beijing Going Forward, Promoting Family and Motherhood at the Fourth World Conference on Women. She has been involved in numerous successful humanitarian projects in locations all around the world. And just as an aside, I was able to hear more of Susan's story last week at a reception, and it really made me reflect when she was sharing about her experience, like actually attending Beijing, that many of those of us who work in human rights, international development, and in the UN and various civil society organizations, it really, her story made me reflect that, we really are standing on the shoulders of giants, in that so much of the work that's taken place in these last 30 years, we wouldn't be here without the work of really people that were willing to sacrifice of their time, their talent, and their treasure 30 years ago to go to China and to help negotiate and inform these discussions by UN member states. So I'm really excited to have her share her perspective with the rest of you who like me may have not been old enough even to have attended Beijing, but certainly have a lot to share and to hear from her wisdom. So with that, Susan, the floor is yours. Susan, you're muted right now. If you could.
I'm sorry. I'm very excited to have the opportunity to share our experiences in Beijing. And I will put up my PowerPoint to start. And let's see, let's get up to the beginning of it. Whoa. That's not my latest PowerPoint. Well, that's okay. Yes, it is. Okay. Anyway, this is a very short version of what happened to me in Beijing, and I'm not really going forward now, but it is in the book if you're interested in that. And I'm willing to send the book to anyone who would like it on a PDF version of it. So I put my email there, susansroylance@gmail.com. And if you'd like to have a copy of the book in a PDF version, I'm very happy to share it with you. Okay, I was invited to come to the Fourth World Conference on Women by a couple of organizations in the Washington, D.C. area. And that was the NIW and the CWA organizations. And Beverly LaHaye has made a very interesting, I'm going to move just a minute. I'm sorry. I can't see part of my PowerPoint, so I need to change this a little bit. Oh, my goodness. Okay, I'm going to just do it. She made the comment, and it was reported in Washington Times. I do not see this document as helping families. It would break down some of those values that build families and strong women for families. And so they contacted me and wanted me to come and meet with the U.S. delegation. They were gathering people from various parts of the country. And a woman lived in their area who had been one of my campaign managers when I ran for Congress in 1978. And so she was very anxious that I come and participate. So I finally did. Interesting set of circumstances that made that possible. And shortly after I arrived, I went into the linkage caucus, and a woman came rushing through the door and said that the word gender had been bracketed throughout the document. Now today, there are still 219 times of the word gender in the Fourth World Conference on Women document, today meaning the one that was passed at that time. And there are many, many words. I mean, I'm giving you just a few examples here: gender mainstreaming, gender analysis. And so it was very important to those who were reading the document, what did gender really mean? And she moved to bracket it. You'll see the word up here, gender, in brackets right now. What happens is, as they communicate and negotiate, if someone doesn't like something, they'll put it in brackets until we can work out some kind of consensus on what the word means, which is what happened with gender. But I'm sitting in this room, and this woman bursts in the door and says that the word gender had been bracketed. And a great deal of commotion exploded in the room, and they all began to wonder what they should do. And finally, someone said, well, we need to find out who's in this room. Actually, some of my pro-family friends who knew what they were doing. This is my first day, left the room. But as I stood and introduced myself as Susan Roylance from United Families of America, the room broke into laughter and jeers. And it was a life-changing moment for me. I had no idea that people would be so against families. And so after a few minutes, after having people introduce themselves, I asked if I could say something. And Bella Absug was the head of this linkage caucus. I'll talk more about the linkage caucus in a few minutes. And she said, yes, go ahead. And I said, I don't understand why you can't be for the advancement of women and families also. And one woman turned around and she said, well, do you believe in choice? Now, quite honestly, at that point, we didn't use choice so regularly for abortion. But I said, yes, I believe in choice, but I would never choose an abortion. And another woman turned around and she says, do you believe lesbians can be mothers? And I said, well, I believe in motherhood, but as far as I know, there's only one way to become a mother. So at that point, I left the room and sat over on the other side. And Bella came out of the room and she said, I wish you'd have stayed in the room to hear what I said. Well, I never did know exactly what she said, but I think she pointed out how I was being discriminated against, as many of them are discriminated against at times. But the thing that happened after that is that Marta Costco, who was a delegate from Honduras, is the one who had moved to have the word gender bracketed. And intense pressure was put on her. It's hard to even remember it. And the USAID told her that if she didn't take those brackets off of gender, that they would stop all humanitarian aid to the country of Honduras. And at that time, Honduras was the poorest country in this hemisphere. And she called her president and asked him what to do. And he said, you stand firm, which she did, but the pressure actually made her sick. And when the president, at the end of his term of being president, he told Marta, according to recent information I received, that was the hardest thing that happened to him during the time of his presidency. So you can see what intense pressure was put on that. Well, I went home. I shared this the other day. I went home and I stood in my kitchen and looked at the Wasatch Front Mountains that I could see out of my kitchen window. And I said, we have a good governor in our state. We have good legislature. I mean, they're not perfect, but they're good. My kids are safe. I don't need to worry about this. And I heard some words in my mind that said, if you who have nothing to lose don't do something, who can? And I decided to go to Beijing. And so I began the process of going to prep comms. And in my book, I give a little more information about that process. And we decided with the Utah Association of Women and United Families of America, it was at the time, later became international, we decided to work for a positive representation of women as mothers in their families. So it's kind of a dual thing, working for motherhood and families. Well, when we arrived at Beijing, you can see in this picture, my good friend, Mary Barton, she went with me, and we were both delegates to the conference, and Gracia Jones she got her credentials as a media person from the Deseret News. So the three of us arrived and we had all these boxes and many things because we were really prepared to have a wonderful booth at the forum. The forum proceeded for 10 days, preceded the conference. And we were really worried about getting it all through. And one of the boxes had broken. And there was a booklet from the Wheatley Institute, and it told about 3 projects that they had in Beijing. And so the guy who was in customs, he reached out and pulled that booklet out and looked at it and saw those 3 projects in China and just shoot us right through. We had no problem. So that really took away some of the anxiety for us. And you can see in that picture that I'm wearing my white I Choose Motherhood jacket. I have it on today. You probably can't see. Maybe if I hold this up, maybe you can see the logo that's on it. And I wore that the entire time I was there. And it really did create some interest. A man from Reuters came, a journalist came and asked me what our goals were at the conference. And And when I'd ride in a taxi, they had been told to worry about these women that were coming to China. They might take off their clothes to make some demonstrations and things. So they were a little worried when I had this jacket. So I had to be a little bit careful when I was out among taxi drivers or things like that. It was an interesting experience. You can see the back of the jacket there. And also I met Carol Ugachukwu and some other people on our plane because I had the jacket on. Now, the forum, as I said, lasted for 10 days from August 30th to September 8th, and the conference itself started on September 4th. And we probably spent about 3 days of our time in trying to work out our housing. We had a place to stay, but the owner of the apartments where we were staying with some people got nervous about having some of these women stay. So it was an interesting situation there. But Mary Barton was so wonderful. She was over the forum and she had it really organized. We had CDs. We played a CD of Roylance piano playing during the time we were there. And we had this big petition that we had prepared for women to sign and ask the conference to represent women as mothers. And it was really interesting. We had women come by. They were so happy that somebody was recognizing mothers. And as they would sign their name, some of them would almost cry as they were, well, they did cry as they were recognizing their mother. So it was a very precious place, our booth at the forum. And then, of course, we went to the conference. At the conference, I had quite a bit of conference or meeting with U.S. delegation before I went to Beijing. I had gone back to another PrepCom, and you'll see Sharon Kotok in the bottom picture. She's sitting there with Mary and I. She was kind of the head of the delegation for working with the negotiations. And then you see in 2 other pictures, you see others. I won't say that they loved working with us, but they did. They considered what we had to say. And one of the most important things that happened in relation to that was the family language. Now, I'm not going to go through all this language that you'll see. I'm going to talk about it. And then if you have further questions, I would let you know that in the book on pages 104 to 119, I have some of the same information I have in the negotiating guide that gives you language from Beijing and then some of the other conferences so you can see the good language. But at the time that they were working, finalizing this paragraph on the family, Mary Barton was so good. We had a room that we were allowed to be there, and she was arranging the chairs so there was room for everybody. And it was really kind of it was a very special experience. And we did get some good language in the document. As you can see there, the family is the basic unit of society and as such should be strengthened, should receive comprehensive protection and support. There's other language. I mean, this is not all of that paragraph. But there was one part of it that there was some disagreement on as to whether it should say various forms of the family exist, as you can see in different cultural, political, and social systems. And that's true, but it kind of brought in some of the controversy that was there. But I wanted to show you, you can see some of the other language. Oh, before I leave this, I should point out that it said the upbringing of children requires shared responsibility with women and men and parents and women and men in society as a whole. Well, most of us don't want society deciding what's going to happen with our children. So that wasn't exactly liked, but that was left in. But I did want to show you this various forms of the family. We tried to define this in the Habitat Conference, which was the next major conference. But as you can see, there's a whole list of conference documents that do contain that language now. So it's become almost soft law, which is not very good, but it's not like we can do very much about it anymore because it's become so commonly used. But over on the left side, you'll see there's many different kinds of families, and many of those families are represented in the document for the Beijing document. Single parent families, multi-generational families, extended families, indigenous families, all those are actually mentioned in the document. So the next thing that there was some good language in paragraph 29, you'll see again, I've referenced that, of the social significance of maternity, motherhood, and I guess I can't see that one side, women in the family, you can probably see it, and the upbringing of children. And that was wonderful. Motherhood actually was mentioned in the document, which we had worked very hard for. In my jacket of I Choose Motherhood, it may have helped. We thought it did it sometimes, to some extent. But you can see other places where mothers were mentioned and motherhood. And if you'll see over there, 16 times motherhood or mothers are mentioned in the document. Now, there's, I think, 8 of them that are referencing young mothers, which of course have special needs and special concerns. But today, to get family in a document and to get motherhood and mothers in a document is extremely hard. So it was a good thing then, and there are good things to remember and bring forward. Okay, and of course that brings up the issue of abortion. And in paragraph 106K, it says, in no case should abortion be promoted as a method of family planning. Well, a high percentage of the abortions, in fact, probably 90% at least of the abortions that are performed now are a method of family planning. And so the document was opposed to that. It did talk about, well, as you can see in 94 and 97, it talks about the best chance of having a healthy infant. And I love those 2 paragraphs because that's what we really want, is we want to enable a woman to go safely through pregnancy and childbirth and provide the couple with the best chance of having a healthy infant. So if we focus on that, I guess my mode that I've used from then to today is I like to find the good language and promote it. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we talk about Bella Abzug. Okay, the next thing was parents. And I spent a lot of time trying to get good language on parents. We prepared flyers and distributed them. We could do that in those days. You can't do that as readily now. They don't let you distribute leaflets. And now we can't even get to the delegates that are negotiating by and large. It's wonderful to have someone like Rachana who's doing such a wonderful job in helping in that area and lets us know what's going on. Because in those days, they would be negotiating and then they'd break for a while. And we could go down and talk to the delegates and we had an opportunity to develop a good relationship with them. And so my role was to find the good language and promote it. And as you can see, paragraph 267 talks about responsibilities, rights, and duties of parents. And that is also, those same words are also in 3 other paragraphs, as well as paragraph 267 is referred to in several, I think 4 different different paragraphs. And we worked very hard on that. I remember 267 was a great win from our point of view in promoting parents and families. And then there's some beautiful language, probably better in this document than any other I know about about religion. In paragraph 24, particularly talks about religion, spirituality, and belief that play a central role. And then also the freedom of thought, conscience, and religion is inalienable and must be universally enjoyed. That language wasn't easy to get. And also in 9 and 12, we'll talk a little bit more about 9 particularly later on. But we did. And I think, well, anyway, we had great delegations that did work for that. And the brackets were eventually taken off. So that was wonderful. And we have religion, the words in it 30 times, and the word spiritual in it 6 times. Again, those are things that are very, very difficult now. Okay, here's Bella Abzug. Actually, there's 3 people there. The first one is Bella. She has the hat on. She always had hats on. She always had interesting hats on. Then the next one is Madeleine Albright. She was there as representing the Secretary of State for the U.S. And Gertrude Mongella, she's the 3rd one. She's an African woman. She was the conference chair. And I will tell you that I don't know where I am on my time. I guess I'm okay. Near the end, there was still a lot of brackets. And there was a lot of concern that there would even be a document because there was just not going to be consensus. And she gave in on some very important paragraphs. And we'll talk about those more in just a minute. But Bella, I mean, I knew Bella at the national conferences in Houston, and she did not do any of the things I liked. And then here she was at this particular conference. But watching her really helped me in the things that I later did. She was very effective. And at the 4th World Conference on Women, she had these yellow legal-sized papers that had these other, I'll go to the next. There's 7 major conferences in the 90s, and they have really defined the public policy that we deal with today. And of course, the 4th World Conference on Women is number 6, and then there was the Habitat Conference that came afterwards. But she would take language from these other conferences and promote it to be in particular paragraphs in the Fourth World or the Platform for Action. And after that same language has been in several documents, it's really easy to get it in because it's already been approved by the capitals. If you come up with some good language, even though it's very good language and it's new, then the delegates have to check back with their capitals and find out if it's okay. And by the time they say it's okay, the document could be all over. But she had organized it so she was able to get her language in various places very effectively. And she was an amazing woman. I don't like the things we were kind of on both sides of the issues, and she knew me and I knew her, but we didn't communicate very much because we didn't agree. But anyway, those major conferences are very important to gather that information. And as a result, that's what eventually, as I prepared the UN negotiating guide, that's how it developed. And she would repeat language from previous conferences. She would use language that had already been accepted by capitals. She would tell them where to place it in the document. She would give the reason for the language, and then she would lobby before and during the debate. And quite honestly, she could walk on the floor when they were negotiating, and they would not stop her. And she used to say, "We don't run the UN, but they can't run without us." She had people placed. She was very effective, and we tried to learn from her. I tried to learn from her to know what to do next. Okay, here we are at the end of the conference, and standing next to me is Rasha Aldasuki. She was actually she lived in California. She was a professor at a university there, and I met her at the airport on our way home. And I had slept the night before. They'd been negotiating all night, but I hadn't been there, and she had. And she told me that the 4 things that they had worked on so hard were accomplished during the night. The words sexual orientation had been in brackets also. The words were taken out. They didn't take the brackets off, they took the words out. They also deleted paragraph 232F, which was about abortion becoming an international human right. That paragraph was taken out. Then they wanted very much to have cultural values and religious values included. And I mentioned paragraph 9 earlier. That included both of those. They were able to get those in the document. And she says all of the Muslim women stayed there, and they stayed on the benches and things while they're negotiating to provide support for the negotiators, and they were successful. And it was a real, for me, it was very special to meet her. We had worked with her during the lobbying, to know that they had stuck it out to the very end. And after that, I was usually pretty good, somewhat good, to stay and give support to our negotiators that were working on the things that we were working for. Well, as a final picture here, I'm showing that I finally did get to the wall. I didn't get to the wall when others went because I was busy with lobbying. But I have to tell you, it's one of the most, well, it's probably about the most amazing thing I've seen in the world, and I've been in a lot of different places. So I highly recommend it. But over here on the left, you'll see that family, the word family as family only is in the document 78 times. That is, to get the word in one time now is so hard. 19 times also with the multiple of families. Mothers and motherhood is in 16 times. Parents are in 22 times. And religion or spirituality is in 36 times. Now, those who have been negotiating now know that all is so beyond comprehension that we could never do things like that now. Have we succeeded in moving forward? Yes, I think we have. I think there's a lot of things we've accomplished. And I think that they talk about the pushback at the United Nations and all of this as if what we're doing is not good, but what we're doing is trying to protect families. So if you're interested in learning more, the back cover of my book has comparisons on it of the pro-family and the radical feminist worldview. And I can send you the book if you send me your email. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Susan. I mean, the presentation shows such a depth of insight and memory in terms of all the minute details of Beijing and what went into the documents and the language. I recommend everyone, if you get a chance, please get in touch with Susan to have a copy of her book. Before we go into Q&A, if I could remind the audience, please put any questions you have in the chat, or send your questions directly to Marcia Barlow, who is one of our executive board members. And I would like to give both of our speakers, Professor Collette and Susan, an opportunity to dialogue together or to reflect on each other's presentations in case they would like to do that before we begin the Q&A segment. So with that, Susan, I don't know if you'd like to reflect, or Professor Collette first. If not, we can go into the Q&A.
Well, Susan, I want to thank you for such a remarkable presentation that brought to life the Beijing conference in many ways. I have learned from you and when I've come as an NGO representative that lobbying really can make a difference. That sort of staying and waiting and giving support to your delegates, even if they're just coming out to get a cup of coffee or something. So I am really grateful for your personal memories about interacting. And I think the gracious recognition of Bella Abzug's talents and her skill really reinforces the value of your presentation. So thank you for that.
Susan, if you could unmute yourself and start again. Thank you.
I was very impressed with the comments that you made about where we are today and what has come forward. And I recognized many of them. I remember especially the inheritance and what a problem that was. And that was discussed a lot. And there was some movement, probably not enough in Beijing, but it has gone forward. Another one that I noticed that you mentioned, the domestic sharing between men and women in the home. I remember men just thinking that was so crazy that was in the document, that men were supposed to do half of the domestic duties in their family. And yet that has changed a lot also. So there were things you brought up that I thought it was nice to hear that.
Thank you. One of the interesting things I discovered in researching the increasing wealth of women is that at least according to some of the international financial firms, women in the next 10 years will be anticipated to control 1/3 of all the wealth in the world that is generated by their own initiative, like the entrepreneurship, as well as inheritance, which is really quite remarkable, I think.
One other thing, talking about the extreme poverty, my husband and I have spent quite a bit of time in Guatemala in the last 3 years, and there's still a great deal of extreme poverty. And some of the statistics about the situation there are not accurate, because they talk about a lot having changed. The interesting thing about them is that they all have a small farm, at least, that they can grow corn, and that's all they eat, many of them. And they don't have electricity. They don't have a lot of the things that most of us, so they are extreme poverty. They're not just poverty. But I'll tell you, you never see an unhappy child. The mothers nurse the children probably till about 2 years, and the child is with them. The children are always happy. You never hear them whining or crying. Of course, a little teeny baby, but the children, they're a little older. They're very well adjusted. They're not prepared for school, so we're doing a preschool now to try and help them to become prepared for school. And Bob's working with the farmers to increase their income. But there are places in the world where there's still millions who are in extreme poverty.
Thank you both for your reflections. With that, I'll take moderator's privilege, and maybe we could go into the Q&A session. On behalf of the committee, we also apologize. Our second speaker hasn't been able to come on, so we'll just go ahead into some of the questions that you've been sending in. But I'd like to ask a question first to direct to each of the speakers. First question would be to Susan. One of the things you mentioned in that, and in comparison to Beijing versus now, it's a lot harder to bring up issues of motherhood, maternity, family, etc., which were concerns of many women's groups that were present at Beijing in that time. And yet, in my own work at the General Assembly in the last year, I've seen some kind of resurgence of family and mother language, in the sense that, for example, the Pact for the Future, which was just adopted in September at the high-level meeting with many of the presidents and prime ministers from all over the world, that contains language on intergenerational solidarity, the importance of family-friendly and family-oriented policies and programs, the need for that to contribute to sustainable development, etc. So, with that, with those kinds of developments, and also of course, the General Assembly adopted in the 79th session a resolution on the International Year of the Family, commemorating the 30th anniversary of that. So could you reflect a little bit more on potentially what that means in terms of the broader linkage of the issues that were present in Beijing regarding regarding women and girls, to how which recognizes the role of the family and women's contributions to the family, and the role of the family in contributing to the well-being of women. How would you reflect on these recent developments that have taken place in the last year, and what that means going forward for the next potentially 30 years?
Well, there has been some excellent lobbying currently. There is United Families and probably many others. There are various NGO organizations that are pro-family now, who have developed relationships with countries that are more pro-family. A great example is Argentina. They have actually changed. They have a new president, and the people that came just to the CSW, where you are now, were just wonderful. And so there's been a change there, but there has been some good movement towards family and motherhood issues, and which generally is against abortion, that are more for healthy children being born. It's a huge, huge problem right now. I remember back in the beginning when there was everything at the Beijing conference was all about this terrible population explosion that was happening. And now we have this terrible reduction of population that is going on. But I do think that family-friendly language that's in the Pact for the Future, I think that's really wonderful. That is something that's new, and the ability to get that in. And then there was some recognition in the digital document. However, it did give children's rights that I thought was pretty much when you're talking about the internet. So I just think it's because people have become more active and they're developing relationships. And so there's a goodly number of delegates now. It's the delegates that make the difference. It's not people like us, because all we can do is talk to them and hope that they'll negotiate in the right way. But it's made a big difference.
Thank you so much, Susan. And then I have a question for Professor Collette. I really appreciated the aspects of your presentation, discussing capacity building, financial inclusion, the reform of laws around women's access to financial services, and things like that for their economic empowerment. And as I'm sure that was the case in Beijing, there's always been a pressure for, in one sense, of having women conform to societal expectations to meet the competing demands of sometimes work, family life, and etc. And of course, we've seen some countries adopt at the subnational level, policies to try to ameliorate some of those frictions and tensions. A prominent example I've just heard is some taxing policy in Europe to help ease the burdens of motherhood in, I believe, in Central Europe. There's other policies on special protective measures under CEDAW and other international human rights instruments. Could you reflect more on what potential policies and programs countries could adopt at the national level, or maybe best practices you've seen in your own state or your own country of the United States that could be conducive to further realizing the goals and the aspirations that women brought to Beijing 30 years ago that maybe have not been realized since yet?
Well, I had the privilege of consulting with the Polish government briefly on family law. And one of the interesting innovations that is proposed and has been enacted in some Eastern European countries, which as a grandmother I adore, is that instead of the emphasis on paid childcare and expanding paid childcare, there is a provision that where you have a social security system, a system of payments for retirement, that when a grandparent retires, in order to care for grandchildren, that accelerates their eligibility for the retirement benefits. So if in fact the age of Social Security here in the United States is 67 for full Social Security, if you are stepping away from paid work in order to care for your grandchildren at 64, you would get the full benefits rather than having the reduced benefits, which I think is an amazingly family-friendly solution to this idea, because at least in the American literature, and I confess I'm not familiar with literature in other countries, but there really is a sharp distinction between children that have at least a substantial amount of time during those tender years from a family member than from a daycare center or that sort of thing. And so I think that's a really interesting solution to that. Some of the other things that, interestingly enough, the Secretary General mentioned in this draft of their report is that the work from home movement, that the pandemic, of course, accelerated the development of the technological tools to work from home but that it's a double-edged sword, that what we're seeing, and certainly in the United States, we're seeing the demand by major corporations that people, and by the government, that people come back into the office sort of thing, which makes it extremely difficult to simultaneously care for family members while you're working. That in fact, that could be used as a solution and has been used as a solution in some instances, but it does reduce the possibility of advancement because you're not interacting necessarily with management in the same way that you would if you're physically in the office, and that your work gets evaluated differently if it's done that way. And so I think that's something that, at least in the developing world, in the developed world, that this work from home needs to be really carefully thought through so that you don't incur penalties, but you do have that flexibility that a child's sick, or maybe not even the child is sick, but you simply want to be the one who is there to help. The legalization of homeschooling. We know that that's a hot issue among various countries. Germany has a very different attitude to it than the United States does. We've got a case coming before the U.S. Supreme Court that may have some implications for that, because we have a state that has agreed to provide public funding for a Catholic school as part of the public education system, because it's a charter school. It'll be interesting to see how that case comes out. So this integration of early childhood education and work life is something that I think we're struggling with. But the problems in the developing world are much different than that. Susan was talking about the small family farms of subsistence farming, that you really don't see this conflict because everybody works on a family farm. It doesn't matter what age you are, sort of thing. And so I think we have to be really sensitive to subsidiarity and to the fact that solutions that work for the United States and for Germany and for England are not the solutions that are going to work for El Salvador or Guatemala or for Sierra Leone or those sorts of things. And I'm not sure the UN does a good job of that, frankly.
Thank you so much, Professor Collette. With that, we'll now go into the questions from the audience for the last 15 minutes. So some of you have already been sending questions to Marcia or have been putting them in the chat, so thank you for that. I'm just gonna go through it first and really just present it out, and then whichever speaker feels best equipped to answer them, please feel free to chime in. So the first question I have is, what did civil society engagement look like at Beijing? Were there a lot of NGOs there participating? And if so, how? And is it different than what you might see at UN meetings today? I think you already addressed that last part a little bit, Susan, in that it's sometimes a little bit harder for NGOs to be involved. But could you maybe answer the first part of that question?
Well, there were 40,000 there. How does that sound? There were 40,000 there, and it was very hectic for China. They hadn't, I don't know that they hadn't expected that many, but housing was a huge problem. They put up these buildings that weren't quite done yet, and it was very interesting where there were so many people there. But the focus really was on the forum before the conference, because the people came to tell the story about their organization and to get support for it. Whereas the conference was more, focused on the language and trying to produce a good platform for action. So it wasn't as heavy involvement in the conference as there was at the forum.
Right. Thank you so much, Susan. This is another question from Lynn Walsh, putting in the group chat. What is, and for both of the speakers, what is the situation regarding marriage internationally in developing countries especially? Do we have data around marriage decreasing domestic violence, poverty, or increasing the shared domestic duties? I believe issues sort of surrounding that angle. If either of you are welcome to chime in regarding that, regarding marriage in developing countries and how that can be beneficial.
Again, I apologize. My knowledge about the marriage movement, et cetera, is primarily domestic. There's a wonderful new book out called Get Married that talks about all the advantages. And we know, at least from data from Western Europe and from the United States, that domestic violence is far less likely to occur in a marriage situation. But whether or not that's true in countries that have such different cultural histories in Asia and Africa and Latin America, I don't know. I know that there, of course, the salacious reporting that surrounds it, but I've not seen the sort of scholarly work that we get from the University of Virginia and the University of Texas that really gives us that confidence that marriage is so very important for social stability and the flourishing not only of the individual, but the flourishing of society as a whole. So I would assume it works the same way because human nature is human nature, but I don't know that to be true.
Susan, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, yeah, we've lived both in Africa for 4 years, and then in Guatemala for, about 2.5 years. And I've seen in both cases things where they talk about marriage and the problems, and we've known in Guatemala, there were a lot of people who they considered themselves married, but they were not legally married. You didn't see, this changing partners like you do in developed countries a lot. And so you did see the cohesion that comes from a family that's firmly has a mother and father and children. But I just want to comment really quick. The one thing I discovered in Guatemala, we were taking pictures of families in an event, and I recognized that they only had 2 children, most of them, and some of them 3. But that's not common in a developing country, because they generally, especially in very poor areas. And so I've got a lot of theories as to why that's the case. The kind of contraception that makes it into the hands of very poor people, probably a lot of it coming through the United Nations programs or USAID. But I found that to be very interesting. Very interesting.
Rashawn, if I might add, one of the concerns that is alive and real here in the United States, which I think we'll see throughout the developing world as well, or throughout the developed world, is the largest percentage of divorces, not the number, but the largest percentage of divorces are among people that are 60 years of age or older. It's called the gray divorce phenomena. And I had the opportunity to testify in front of a state legislature. And I know there have been congressional hearings about what that's going to do to Social Security, because while 2 can't live as cheaply as 1, they can certainly live cheaper than 2. And so, you have to have multiple houses, you have to have multiple transportation, et cetera. And so this phenomena of divorce in your senior years is going to have a significant impact, especially with the graying of societies, a significant impact on public resources that are available.
Thank you, Professor. I have another question here from Claire Dwyer. Claire asks, and again, for both of the speakers, whoever feels comfortable to share about this, what impact did the Beijing conference have on the use of the word gender in our language and our culture? And I don't know if anyone wanted to refer also to the Annex 4 of the Beijing conference itself and discuss more about. And we talked about it in passing and a number of terminologies, but if any of you want to comment on how gender has it's impacted our language and culture, the references.
I could deal with that. It was really interesting how they set up this committee that met for a whole month to determine the definition of gender. And the definition, which is also in my book, is there is no new definition. So basically that meant it's the generally accepted usage of the word. However, yeah, gender has definitely changed over this time. I mean, what gender means now is very much different. However, they talked about all of that at that time. A lot of people think this whole gender movement now is new, and it was very much there then. And 219 times in the document with gender is major, and it was a conscious effort to get all of that. It kind of started in Beijing at the ICPD conference, International Conference on Population and Development. It started there, and as you look back in the documents in that conference, it has a lot of the same language that we were concerned about in Beijing. But now, a lot of that language, it's very hard to keep that language out that may be considered as non-pro-family.
I have an interesting question regarding someone I think mentioned the presence of men at Beijing. I don't see the question now. I'm not sure if it was deleted. Oh, from Lynn, did men attend Beijing? Pro-family men. How are we doing getting men on the pro-family side? I believe the latest political declaration recognized, for example, the role of men and boys in helping to empower women and girls. And oftentimes, these conversations surrounding gender issues or issues of women and girls can be antagonistic. But maybe for both of the speakers, how could you reflect a little bit on the presence of men's groups or other broader family groups involved at Beijing that could have informed the discussions?
Susan, refer to you about what happened at Beijing.
At Beijing, there were men who did have a significant part. Not a lot, but there were some. I remember some that I very much enjoyed working with. They were very, very good. Are there as many men now that are actually involved in that NGO negotiating effort, lobbying effort? I don't think so. Not in the CSW, those conferences that are specifically for women, but they are like in CPD. That you see it there. You see it in other conferences. I think that sometimes we get overly focused on women's issues and think that that's what's driving everything at the UN. It's partially driving it, but it's not a treaty. I mean, we do have CEDAW, which is a treaty, but the things that come through from Beijing. However, I did one time when we were in Pakistan, they told us that if at that time Pakistan was very poor, this was 1 year before 9/11. And the US became very involved after 9/11 in helping Pakistan. But they said that because of the Beijing document, if they were not in compliance with the Beijing document and working to reduce their population, their fertility of women to 2 per woman, they had to show that they were working vigorously to accomplish that in order to be able to borrow any money from the World Bank or from IMF. I found that really interesting. So it isn't a treaty, but if they've signed on and agreed to follow it, there were certain things that the UN was doing that would have an impact on that. And I don't know how I got into that, but
Thank you, Susan. I believe we actually have a comment from someone in the chat saying that they were at Beijing. Dan Ziedler.
Yes.
Dan, I don't know if you're able to maybe reflect a little bit and follow up on that question. I think it'd be great to hear your perspective as you were also there.
Yes, thanks. There were many men involved in our NGO coalition that we had. We called it the Coalition for Women and Families. There were people who had known or got to know them, each other back in Cairo prior to Beijing, and then at Beijing. But basically, this is one of the beautiful, beautiful things for me that came out of the Beijing conference and the Cairo conference, for example. You had people from all over the world very concerned about life and family, and they came together without a plan, really. And it was beautiful how they all worked together and how we had an impact on the delegations. We had many people from Latin America who were there. And fortunately, at that time, many of the countries from Latin America had pro-life people, pro-life families, pro-life family people. And we were able to network with them. And another thing that that was so positive, when something came up on the floor that was of concern to us, we'd frequently get back to our contacts in the respective countries and say, we need pressure, we need media coverage, we need you to talk to so-and-so, the president or whoever. And frequently that happened, and that brought results. The coalition building effort was really excellent. And one of our modus operandi that Susan mentioned was our little sheets, our little information sheets.
Yes.
We were told early on by knowledgeable delegates, if you're going to try to lobby a delegate, don't give them 3 or 4 or 5 pages. Give them one sheet, big type, one side, with just your basic message. And I think we developed that to a huge success. I have, for example, if anybody's interested, I have a file. It's actually a couple of these binders set together with the sheets that we used in Cairo on all these different issues. And just looking at them, I think it would be very, very rich. So if somebody wants to contact me, I can send them. They're in 4 different PDF files. And I think it will give you a very good feel for the work of the volunteers from these NGOs and how we tried to impact on the various issues. Talks a lot about gender, talks about the right to life, talks about family. That's one comment I have. I'll go quickly. I have a second comment. I don't know if you can see the book. It's almost 1,000 pages. I urge you to see if you can get a copy. Serving the Human Family, the Holy See at the major United Nations conferences during the 90s. That was put together, and reading these documents, they're all the official statements of the Holy See at these meetings. It's something very, very enlightening if you haven't seen that or are not aware of that. The other thing I would mention about Beijing is Mother Teresa. Mercedes Wilson, who was a delegate, an official government delegate from Guatemala at the time, very good friends with Mother Teresa. She asked Mother Teresa if she would write a letter to the delegates, all of the delegates in Beijing, and she did. It's a beautiful letter. We handed that out. We had a copy machine in our hotel room that worked day and night, so we had enough copies to give to people. It's a precious statement, and it's worth reading for anybody. So I can get that to anybody who's interested. The role of the coalition, again, was just something, and I'll end with this, something just really miraculous for me, marvelous. People reacted so generously, so selflessly. There was no egos. There were no egos that I saw in the hundreds of people that were active in the NGO coalition that we had, by the grace of God.
There was no religious separation either. If we believed in God, we were all together.
Yes, we were. We had our friend Majid Khatme, who was a Muslim from England, who was part of our coalition. Wonderful.
Thank you so much for sharing your perspectives, Dan. And out of deference for time and the event, I'll just have each of the speakers, but I'll adapt a question that was sent to Lynn, just maybe in 30 seconds or less. If each of the speakers could present, looking forward to the next 30 years, for those of us who work in international organizations on family issues, on family policy, what advice or wisdom would you share for us looking towards the next 30 years? I know it's a broad question, but would love to hear your answers, and then we can close. Professor Collette, maybe you could go first.
I think we are seeing the intrinsic value of the natural family, and we have not succeeded in persuading our neighbors and our governments about that. But I'm afraid the adverse consequences of getting away from that are going to persuade them, and we need to be ready to help reconstruct the civilization of love and the culture of life. And I'm thrilled to see young people like you in the position you're in, Roshana. And we're blessed by having people who have the broad experience of Susan and Dan and others, Lynn. And so do not be disheartened. We will prevail because the natural family is the best source of a flourishing society.
Thank you, Professor Collette. Susan.
Well, I think for my part, since I was so involved with documents and language and that sort of thing, the thing that is kind of missing now that it wasn't before that we really need is personal relationships with delegates from countries, so that when there's an emergency like Dan was talking about, we know who we can get in touch with and that they can respond. And so I think that we need to really work on that. I know some NGOs are doing that, but I think that's really critical, so that we develop those. Well, we have the group of the family, which the countries, I think, I don't know how many it is now, has really done that. But I think that's, if we really want to prevail, which to some extent we're really doing that now, that's very important that we develop those relationships, because the delegates are the ones that make the difference. We as NGOs could only talk to the delegates, and they do the negotiating.
Thank you so much, Susan. And with that, I want to thank all of the presenters who have joined us today. On behalf of the Executive Board of the NGO Committee and the family, we look forward to welcoming you again to our next event next month on April 8th on the second annual Family Policy and Population Research Forum. Please visit our website if you'd like any more information on that. And I hope you have a great rest of the day. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.